Hello and good morning from sunny California to all of our viewers today. I am Lila Taylor, Chief Business Officer at Demy-Colton, and on behalf of our sponsor, Lattice Point, our partner for this exclusive salon, Biotech Digital Partnering, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 45th installment of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series. As usual, we welcome all past participants back, and all of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. Demy-Colton's mission is to convene healthcare industry leaders to catalyze change. And we do this through in-person events, including BioFuture, our CEO summits, our virtual salon, such as today, and Biotech Showcase. The topic for today's salon is Increasing the Stakes, Creating and Selling Your Valuation Story in Changing Times. Before we start the salon, I'd like to introduce Patrick Frey, founder and CEO of Venture Valuation, as well as Biotech Digital Partnering located in Zurich, Switzerland, who would also like to say a few words.
Yes, hello everybody, and also a warm welcome from my side, from rainy Switzerland. I welcome everybody also back. It's a pleasure to be part of this virtual salon again. We actually run Biotech Digital Partnering. So this is a whole week of virtual partnering that we make available. It's now the 17th edition that we do. And the goal was actually, when we started during COVID, to provide a platform for people to be able to do business development and networking. And so we continue to do that. Obviously, it's complementary to face-to-face events like the BioFuture, where we also partner with Demy-Colton. So we're happy to partner again and to continue this partnership. And also the topic, obviously very relevant. Heading back and yeah, it's a pleasure to be part of this. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I'd like to cover some housekeeping notes before I turn the virtual mic over to our moderator. The salon will start with a 50 to 55-minute discussion, which will be followed by a Q&A session. Also note that this salon is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. Now for today's salon. I am pleased to introduce our co-moderators, Ted Hack, Vice President, Lattice Point, and Andrea Sotak, founder and CEO, Foray Healthcare Advisors, and our panelist, Raquel Jacques, former CEO of Akari Therapeutics, and Nicholas Coble, CEO of Epilepsy GTX. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to Ted and Andrea. I will return during the Q&A session.
Great. Thanks very much, Lila, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We have a really great group of panelists today to have this discussion, and hope it's informative for all of you. We're going to do a quick round of introductions. Myself, I'm Vice President at Lattice Point Consulting, based in the US. Most of our group is based in Switzerland, and served about 18 or 19 years in industry in various market access roles, both in genetics as well as in primary care and specialty care roles at places like Pfizer and Genzyme, and have been working with earlier stage companies for about the past 10 years. Andrea?
Thanks, Ted. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Sotak. I've spent my career focused on therapeutics as an investor, strategic advisor, and business operations leader.
Andrea? Andrea, it's, your Wi-Fi is a little blinky at the moment. So maybe I'll go to Rochelle and to Nicola for their intros first. Rochelle?
Hi, Ted. Thanks. I was wondering if it was my connection, so I started to get a little bit worried here. Sometimes where I am, we can have some spotty service. So good to meet everybody. Rochelle Jacques, biotech executive, have been most recently CEO of Akari Therapeutics, previously CEO of Enzivant Therapeutics. And then before that, really spending time in some kind of larger to mid-size biopharma. Baxter spun off Baxalta, acquired by Shire, and then went to Alexion, where I was leading the global complement franchise. So my primary focus has been in commercial and financial roles. And so I say I'm more of a business person, but certainly immersed in the science as always, and always learning from colleagues. So happy to be here. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Nicolas?
Thank you, Ted. Hello, everyone. My name is Nicholas Kerbal. So since late 2022, I've been the CEO of Epilepsy GTX. So we are a biotech company developing AAV intraparenchymal gene therapy for focal refractory epilepsy. At this point, I'm looking to raise funds to advance our lead program into the clinic. So it is a Series A, so it's very relevant for the discussion today. And in my previous role, I was one of the founders and the first employee of Orchard Therapeutics. So Orchard is a gene therapy company developing and commercializing stem cell gene therapies for metabolic disorders and immune disorders. And so I was involved in the various fundraisers of the company, starting with the Series A and then culminating with the IPO in 2018. And Orchard was recently acquired by Kiowa in the first quarter of this year. So great to be here. Thank you.
Great. And Andrea, now that you're back online, we'll come over to you.
I'll give it another try. Sorry.
Andrew, maybe we go without it's still a little blinky, so maybe we go without video so that the audio is clean, and try that. And it's still frozen. Tell you what, we're going to jump in. I'll introduce Andrea on her behalf, given the technical difficulty. So Andrea was Chief Investment Officer at DRI Capital, which is one of the royalty investors, typically with a strategy of investing at people at peri-launch or post-launch and taking a synthetic royalty off of revenue sales. So a lot of work on the analysis of income streams, if you think about it from a revenue durability perspective, et cetera. Also worked on DRI's IPO, so has done fundraising in her own right. So lots of good experience there. So as we think about 2024 and really the tail end of 2023, I can remember at the end of 22, people were saying the IPO markets and the capital markets will be back by 24, and it's still rather volatile. The XBI is up from its low. We've seen some IPOs and some of them at really quite nice valuations. However, we're still below average. The private markets are active, M&A is happening, but the levels are still back at about a 2019 level. Bruce Booth recently published his latest blog and said, quote, "The sector is still awash with too many startups. You have an oversupply of startups, and then you have fixed and or reduced demand in the M&A and IPO markets." That said, people have been extending the runway for about the past 2.5 years, really, when you think about it. So as we think about, lessons learned and what can people do differently and what's working, Nicola, we'll start with you as somebody who's raised both on the private side and through the IPO process. What are some of the lessons that you've learned about telling your valuation story along the years?
I think if you ask investors, what are you evaluating, when getting to a decision whether to invest or not? I mean, the answer is we'll always be along the same lines, right? It starts with having robust science. It starts with having a leadership team that is credible and that has experience and is agile and can work up a plan B and a plan C. you need to have a route in the clinic, you need to have a credible commercialization pathway. So the ingredients are usually all the same, right? One of the things that I have learned is sometimes companies fail because they're not able to tell a clear story about the unmet need in the disease they operate in, and the role that the medicine they're developing will take in that disease. And it's sometimes a difficult exercise, because for investors, you need to have a simple, dumbed down, clear story, right? Tell me what medicine you're going to deliver. On the other hand, when you speak to disease experts, you need to have nuance in the way you position your medicine, right? You can't be just black and white, especially in diseases where there are alternative treatment options. And so this is something that is sometimes not straightforward, and it's very important to have a very clear, statement to make about the unmet need in the disease and what role the medicine is going to play, and ideally one that will be consistent with what disease experts that do not have a vested interest in the company will always say, right? So that's not always easy.
We'll come back to that comment in a minute, but in a sense, it's you actually have two decks, right? Two stories. One, the more scientific SAB-like, if I can say it that way, and one more on the finance side. Is there, somebody said to me once, is there a pot of gold at the end of this study rainbow?
Sure.
Rochelle, your thoughts on this?
Now, I would have to agree. People want to know about what's at the end, and we're great at telling the scientific story. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time, educating folks on how to tell a good scientific story. That's something we've got down. But the other two components, Nicholas, that you mentioned, one around capabilities and the other around the commercial opportunity are really important. I think we can improve in both of those areas, and that's a place where capabilities, I think, is a little bit easier. We just need to expand our thinking beyond the typical slide with the leadership team on it and a couple of logos, and really talk about why are those the right people and what skills have they built, but also in other, in various areas where we might be working, there are other things that we need as capabilities to be successful. And if you take like the regenerative medicines, cell, gene, tissue-based therapies, and look at CMC, that better be something you're talking about from a capability standpoint, because you're going to need it to win. And I would add to that, if you think of something completely different, vaccines or obesity drugs, it's not very exciting, maybe if you're used to talking about glamorous science, but supply chain management is really important. And you better have a plan for a capability there. And of course, those discussions happen at the right time. But back to, what is at the end of all of this and the commercial opportunity, I do think that most companies are figuring that story out late in the game. And I would argue that you really need to have a handle on why anybody's going to care about this if you're successful very early on, and certainly before you go into the clinic. And that story evolves. It becomes more nuanced. It becomes more, research and data driven. You don't know about the size of your field team when you're going into phase 1. But you really should have some point of view on why this is important and why stakeholders will care and want to adopt this if you're successful in delivering on the target product profile. So those are areas I think we can do a lot better in the commercial opportunity, and get better at kind of connecting the dots for people. Otherwise, somebody else is going to do that work, and you really don't want them to do that work. You want them to kind of adjust your work on the edges. But you want to give them something to start with. And that's just going to be much more effective because, by the way, we're all spending time every day, every night, every weekend thinking about these things. We're thinking about it more than anybody else. So it's best to put that forward for people to react to and then have a thoughtful discussion around.
Yeah, and sort of underneath both your comments, it's communication skills matter, right? It's not just defending the rigorousness of your science per se. It's, let me tell you why some of these things matter. And I'm glad you brought up the CMC and the cell and gene. With the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, we were down in Washington, D.C. when Scott Gottlieb was the FDA head. And he made a really good point that I don't think a lot of people maybe took on of. He said, I'm not really worried about your efficacy. He said, I'm worried about your safety, because if it works, it works, right? Genes don't spontaneously start to function in nature. But I'm worried about your safety, because that's historically been a problem. And I'm worried about your manufacturing, because I don't know if you guys can do this right. And so sometimes the elephant in the room is maybe not necessarily what you think it is. In terms of, when Nicholas, when you were fundraising on these things, if we take it back, you've raised, I think, 9 figures, if I remember correctly, right? You've raised well over $100 million in your career. How are there specific things that you thought that evolved along the way? Meaning, was it the commercial story? Was it the pricing? Was it the manufacturing? What were the things you said, you know what, we maybe need to amplify this a bit more as we go forward?
So all aspects mattered, Ted. So I think it depends on the type of asset and the disease that is being considered. So in my previous life, when we were developing autologous stem cell lentiviral gene therapies, manufacturing was perhaps more important than it is in my current life, where I'm working on AAV gene therapies for various reasons, right? So the product was more complex to manufacture. The product involves, transducing cells with a lentiviral vector. So understanding the complexity, managing the complexity, and the implications in terms of development timelines and costs was extremely important. Also, the cost of CMC development and the cost of goods were much more significant compared to what I'm experiencing in my current life, with AAV gene therapies, where it's arguably more straightforward, at least for us as a company relying on a CDMO that has, significant experience of it, and also in terms of cost of goods. So it is not an area I'm losing sleep about today, but in my previous life, it was probably one of the top 3 topics, for us when we were raising money. So I would say it depends really on the asset and the target disease area.
And
so,
I would just, I
Michelle.
would add, sorry to jump in, but I would add to that, it does evolve. Your story evolves over time because the outside world changes as well. So you've got all of your internal things that are changing. You obviously want to, make progress updates to your story based on what you've learned and what you've accomplished. But also the outside world is changing, and you need to kind of think about that as you adapt your story. I always think about the story as it's not an event, it's a process. And many times you're going to be talking with these same folks many, many times, over a year or years. And it's a process. And it will continue to change. And we also have to think about changes on their side. There are people on the other side of the table or screen or whatever it may be. But their circumstances change as well. And I think we could talk for a long time what's gone on in the capital markets for the last couple of years and for investors. But we have to take that into account as well.
Yeah, one of the discussions, I work with an incubator, and I've heard this through my entire career, the old saying of the point of the first meeting is actually to get a second meeting, right? And sort of develop that process as you go along. And I think especially on if you take the scientific founder, the university type spinouts, a lot of them just it's like defending their dissertation, right? They got to close today, and it's like, well, hold on, maybe not so. Andrea, sort of switching to you on this sort of topic, as people came to you as a chief investment officer, what are the sort of dynamics from the story that sort of resonated with you? What were some of the things that you thought people should be doing? Both you were in an interesting spot. You both raised money via an IPO, but you're also on the investment committee side talking about where to deploy money. So what were some of the things that you thought companies should be thinking and doing to tell their valuation story?
Yeah, thanks, Ted, and sorry for all the technical issues. I've missed a little bit of the conversation, so I might be repeating some points here. I think, a couple of just best practices, really understanding who your audience is, what the message is that you're trying to convey, making sure that it's a message that does land with your audience. So, I heard a little bit at the beginning about scientific versus other messages. So making sure that the message that you're conveying is easy to digest and easy to engage with. I think those are really important points. Understanding the kind of questions that people have asked you in the past and being able to anticipate those questions as well and having answers at the ready. And then, maybe, switching tracks a little bit as well, making sure that you have information available. So, information from external, credible, independent, objective sources. I think that really helps to strengthen the message as well, whether it's, data or information from, your advisors, that sort of thing, that can really help to drive a message home and make it less so about, hey, just believe me, and more so about, here's, a bunch of other people who are aligned with this thinking and why you should believe me.
And Andrea, just on top of some of the comments that Rochelle and Nicola made, when people would come to you with an investment opportunity, one of the dynamics, I think Rochelle, you made the comment of it's not just the shiny faces and logos on your management team slide. It's actually, what do they bring to the party? So as an investor, were you looking to see that it was more than just one person in the room, that you could sort of interrogate others as well?
It's interesting. That wasn't really the situation that I was in that often back then, but I see that much more so now. And yeah, I do think it's important that you have a team around you, skills. I think it's important for a lot of reasons. Obviously, it's helpful for your business, but also looking at it from the point of view of investor. Seeing a team that can collaborate, seeing a team that has different types of experiences, just is going to give me confidence as well that there's not going to just be one way that problems get solved or one approach, but that diversity of opinion is going to deliver more thoughtful, better solutions in the long run.
Great. So Andrew, do you want to jump into the sort of commercial side of things in terms of some of the dynamics there?
Sure. So, and again, please correct me if I'm playing catch up.
Oh, you are good to go.
So, I think it's being mentioned. I heard a little bit about it being mentioned that, we can tend to focus on, more of the clinical risks associated with opportunities, and that's something that we're all sort of familiar and thinking about. But I think practically speaking, and just looking at, some recent analysis that was published by Stiefel, for example, a lot of times you have products that, get through approval, get launched to the market, and then you see a decline in stock performance because really those products are not meeting expectations. So I'm just curious to know, as you think about these commercial things, how early in the process, is it worthwhile to think about it? Is it really right from the beginning as you're developing your compound? Is it somewhere, prior to phase 3? I don't know, Ted, what is your experience having been in industry and also being, someone who advises companies?
Yeah, it can be done earlier than a lot of people think, and there's sort of two ways to go about it. If you're just trying to figure out if something works, very, petri dish animal models, that's one thing. I wouldn't really worry too much about the commercial side. But the basics in terms of I've done post proof of concept analyses on this, especially in areas that are highly competitive. One example would be wet AMD. For cell and gene therapies, people are saying, well, what's the current treatment guidelines? What are some of these things that are going? And so in situations, especially where potential investors or commercial partners, licensing partners have these types of questions, a lot of early stage companies can't answer them, right? They're still, 10, 20 people. And so the good news is that a lot of the basics you can really be done with publicly available information, right? You might need an advisor to help you, but is there a market, right? How does the therapeutic market function today? vis-a-vis treatment guidelines, how reimbursement decisions were made. How does that market function? Going to that, how much competition is there in it? What are those other emerging technologies, right? You're not the only new game in town. And so how is that competitive field going to evolve? Will somebody go generic or biosimilar? And how does that impact net pricing over time? You don't have to get, to Rochelle's thing, you don't have to come out with your field plan, how many field reps you're going to have and this sort of a thing, but just those basics of where is it today and what are some assumptions on how it'll go forward. And then from there, just, do some scenario planning. How will your technology ideally operate in that market? And how will it compete over time? And where I go with this with clients, and where we would go with this when I was working on the BD committee when I was in pharma is, what's the horsepower of your product? And then all of that gets you to sort of the clinical side of, well, what's the data and evidence that you think you could generate with your product versus maybe what are some of the needs of the market? And what's helpful with this, is one, you're learning what are you going to be able to do in clinical trials. And the other side is what are you going to do post-launch? So we've talked about gene therapies and cell therapies and some of these more durable technologies. You can't prove durability of effect in a clinical trial, right? You need to do that sort of with real world evidence. And payers love durability of effect. So, we've hit on this a little bit of time, but what is that sort of time frame and how long does it take to see some of these things? But it's telling investors that this is how it's going to evolve. And while we don't have the depth of knowledge necessarily to come to that, you can get some independent views, you can get some actual analogs from the market, and you actually don't have to spend a lot of time or money to do that. I'm thinking about something we did for in women's health with the SERMs. People are looking at osteoporosis, and of course, one of the big risks was breast cancer over time. And somebody had come up with the technology, said, actually, we're going to avoid the breast cancer risk. The problem is you needed 15 years to do that study. And so is that really a good investment decision? So getting some of these things done, especially for an early stage company, one of the really nice benefits to it is it actually starts aligning the clinical team with the commercial market. And what do you actually need to do to be successful? And that actually results in a tighter investment story. Nicola, Rochelle, thoughts, comments, different views?
I have a couple of things I'd add, Ted. I agree with you. Analogs are incredibly important and they're free. So you can go out and find those. And I think in the earlier stages, most of us are hyper focused on the science part of things. And so every financial resource, every people resource is, you're making trade-offs constantly. And so to the extent you can use analogs and external data rather than having to do your own initiated work that's going to cost you some money or have some, folks in the team, dedicated to commercial aspects. It's a little bit easier to handle it that way. And plus then you don't get yourself, kind of stuck with one point of view too early. I see quite often companies will be in phase one talking about what price they're going to charge. This is just, to me, a non-starter. Why would you do that? You have no idea yet what the market's going to look like. You have no idea how good your data will be and what benefits you'll be able to bring. It is, I think, a dangerous thing. That being said, you can say, hey, it probably falls in this category. Look at these other therapeutics, and they're kind of in the same kind of range of delivering this type of value. So that's how you should think about it. And I think helping to answer the specific questions using analogs instead of having to feel like you need your own data to give is important, and it gives you flexibility. Maybe the other thing I'd say is if you're going into a space where there are other, drugs, therapeutics available, the leader in that space is not advertising the shortcomings. So you do need to set up questions that then you plan to answer. You need to create the understanding of some of the gaps and some of the unmet needs. And they might not all be in efficacy, and quite frankly, a lot of them aren't. And you're going to see step change in other ways. But you need to set that up. Nobody is going to do that for you. Sometimes you can use some KOL calls, analyst reports, and other things, surveys they do to help support it. But that is a really important aspect of coming into a competitive space and helping people understand how you're going to compete.
Yeah, the other dynamic I remember saying is, why do you think that the market leader wants to give you share?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
They're going to defend
exactly.
themselves. Nicholas.
So I echo what what Rachel has been saying. So the commercial thinking needs to be sort of part of the planning since the preclinical stage, frankly, and I absolutely agree with that. So at the preclinical stage, I would sort of say that you need to be commercially aware. In the clinical development, you need to be commercially savvy, and then in the commercial phase, you need to be expert, right? And sort of my observation as far as the preclinical stage is concerned, it's good to have to hand somewhere in your back pocket a target product profile, right? That you have discussed and reviewed and rehearsed with the team. It's a very good tool to align the scientific function, the clinical development function, the regulatory function, and the commercial function, right? Even though there are a lot of unknowns, right? To Rachel's point, you don't really know what medicine you're going to have, but you need to have a sense of the comparator, right? And there are different scenarios there. So you could also have a couple of variants of the target product profile, assuming two different comparators, because that will determine the extent of your differentiation in terms of efficacy, tolerability, convenience, mode of administration, etc. But it's a very good exercise to go through and a very good tool actually to communicate with prospective investors. You could also try to do some quantitative work. So in my case, I found it very useful to do an early pharmacoeconomic assessment. It turns out that in the disease that we're interested in, my present company, refractory epilepsy, NICE had evaluated the value of surgery, resective surgery, as an alternative to anti-seizure medicines. And so we commissioned a work with a specialized consultancy who sort of replicated the model of NICE, and we used that to evaluate the potential attractiveness of gene therapy. It's been quite useful to placate some objections of investors, even though there are a number of unknowns. So it's a bit of an iterative exercise, and the target product profile is sort of the green on a golf course, where the closer you get to the green, the more definition you can put on it. But it's certainly good to have it in your back pocket. Yeah,
I always, some people struggle with the aspirational statement, and I include myself in that. But in the end, it's actually the goal, right? It's this is where we want to be, and as this evolves and changes, we'll sort of go there. And I think that's really you do have to do that early on. That said, some of these things have come about, and over what's been the hot investment over the past 10 years, it has changed, and it's not just COVID that did that. But as we think through 10 years ago, gene therapies were the hottest thing in town, right? Always oncology as well. But in terms of depending on what you read, certain therapeutic areas or certain dynamics are out of favor. People always say platform is out and gene is out. But for folks like you all who have been doing this for quite a number of years, are you seeing certain types of products or certain markets where things are getting harder or easier to generate interest?
Rachel, do you want to go first?
No, because I think I want to, because I'll encroach on your gene therapy insight. So you go.
All right, thank you. So just let's focusing on gene therapy, if that's all right with with the audience. So it's true that 5 to 10 years ago we were in favor, we were en vogue, right? So and you could raise tens of millions of pounds or dollars with a good in vitro proof of concept, right? Today, it's much more challenging, right? So the burden of proof is much higher. So as someone from the industry, I think we need beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So the best we can do in our companies is to discharge risk, right? And build sort of relationships with investors over time, right? So it's difficult to to convince investors to invest in the company within 3 to 6 months. So my experience is it's taking an awful lot of time to move an investor, towards an investment committee decision, and the burden of proof is very high. Now you can ask yourself, why is it that investors are, why is it that the bar is much higher in gene therapy? I mean, part of the answer is investors who have invested in gene therapy have found it difficult to monetize their investments, right? Because it's taken longer than anticipated for gene therapies to get to an approval. In some cases, it's been 4 to 5 years from starting clinical trials, but in other cases, it's been 12 to 13 years. So on average, it's taken as long, as for conventional therapies. And in addition, approved gene therapies have not had the kind of uptake that was anticipated for a variety of reasons, right? Because there was a disconnect between the price and the differentiation of the medicine. But I would also argue there have been some issues with execution in the commercialization of gene therapies for a variety of reasons, right? So lack of preparation, in the healthcare system, capacity constraints, but frankly, also execution issues within companies that are commercializing gene therapies. The bottom line is that we are sort of punished, right, for not being credible for what we set out to do in time. And so this is the reason why, one of the reasons why the bar has gone up a lot. So that's my experience.
Yeah, there's looking at the market today, if you think about it, Nikolai, you and I met 10 years ago when we were talking about how to create policy change and payment structures for cell and gene, and that's evolved, but it's still not perfect. It's a little bit this first versus second mover advantage. Sometimes second mover is better.
That's right.
Andrea, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm actually just curious, following up on, had your preference, would you rather be explaining your story in a competitive market, or explaining your story as sort of the first in market and being able to sort of create something from the ground up? Because I know, as I think about it from an investor point of view, I think where I've had the most interesting opportunities or seen the most interesting opportunities, it's where there's a novel space and there's maybe a little bit more in terms of degrees of freedom to operate. But just curious, would you rather be, I don't know, arguing against or arguing for something?
It's a great question. Maybe I can jump in for a moment. Andrew, I don't know that I have a preference per se. Each one has its opportunities and each one has its challenges. I spent a lot of time in the rare disease space. Quite often, inevitably, we're working on therapeutics, drugs for patients who have nothing. And, that's a really compelling unmet need. So I think that is an easy part of the story to tell. And from, thinking about, is this going to generate revenue? I think you've got a reasonably compelling story. But going back to what Nicholas said about gene therapy, just as an example, you have to pave the way then for that to become a reality. And it's not just in gene therapy. We're really talking about a kind of a total shakeup in the whole landscape. And that it takes a ton of work and time and a movement to make change. But in a rare disease where you don't, you might not have any of those factors, you may have other things like if these patients, if the focus hasn't been to diagnose them, how are you going to drive diagnosis? How are you going to get the awareness out there? How are you going to, make sure that you can find these folks? So you have your own set of challenges, even if the unmet need is really clear. So I just think, when you tell the story, you have to be fully aware of those things, and you hopefully are planning for those things and how you're going to execute against it. Because I agree, Nicholas, that the execution is really important. And if you aren't really picking up on those nuances and differences, then you aren't preparing for them. And we all know that even when you prepare and you prepare well, it doesn't mean everything goes perfectly. You still are going to find things that you don't expect. And you're going to have to address those, and those are going to take time and affect your uptake. And so, yeah, I think it's just there are a lot of different aspects to it. And maybe I'll also make a comment on this whole concept of things kind of going in and out of favor. you know, we're obviously in a long-term kind of a work here, and our drug development programs are marathons, and you know, things are going in and out of fashion as we're, you know, kind of still driving our programs forward. And if you look at that, I think you really need to be able to interpret why something is in or out of fashion in order to decide what to do. You know, you either have the cash to finance it and there's not a fundamental change in the environment and therefore you keep moving it forward, or maybe there is a fundamental change and it's, you know, it's not relevant anymore. Maybe a new technology came along, maybe a regulatory change or something like that has really truly impacted your program. But going back to rare diseases, you know, these aren't, I'm going to say they're a little bit, you know, not the shiny object of pharma right now, but it's for a reason that makes sense. It's not because there's not opportunity and there's not unmet need, but it's because a lot of pharma companies have a patent cliff and they have giant chunks of revenue that may be disappearing overnight. And if we look at, you know, our understanding of that, we may just well stay the course in rare diseases because the unmet need is there. And we can still make those programs create value for all stakeholders, including for our investors. So, you know, it's all, I say the devil's always in the details in these things, and really having a deep understanding of what's going on before you decide how that impacts your work.
Just if I can jump in quick, it's, you know, it's not just the drug folks, the device and the diagnostics, the digital therapeutics folks. You both talked about preparing the market, and there's an internal and external component to that. There's internal of, no, I don't have to hire sales reps or field reps. I might have to hire MSLs to educate folks on both the disease and the technology, whatever it may be. But there's also the policy aspect, right? Everybody needs to do policy development. Yeah. And it's a lot of young CEOs, they don't know they need to do that, or they maybe don't have the time, and that's all completely understandable. But you know, you go back to JP Morgan and Biotech Showcase the past couple of years, and you talk to the folks that are in the digital side, and they're saying, I'm struggling to tell my story because half the people think I'm a device, half think I'm a diagnostic, and half think I'm a tool, right? And so then there's the commercial side of it, of how many systems are actually going to pay you, or is this a cash pay? And all of that is preparing the market. And so everybody has this problem sort of in a different color dress, if I can say it that way. But it's just, that's really the CEO's job. And this is why, you know, your management team matters. This is why even board selection matters. Some of these things is who can help you along with that. So I don't know if you guys agree or disagree with that, but you see it in different areas for sure.
I mean, this is my experience as well, that we need to think about these things very, very early on. I mean, not later than last week, one of the investors I've been speaking to asked me about coding for gene therapy in epilepsy. I mean, you know, we are 9 years away from having an approval. And it just illustrates the fact that at the end of the day, right, to convince an investor to invest in a company, we will have to have compelling answers to all their 10 or 12 sort of key questions, right? The first question is almost always going to be about the science, right? I mean, robust science is the starting point, right? But then ultimately, we're going to have a good answer on, you know, on our reimbursement strategy, on how we're going to execute the commercialization. You know, do we need to build infrastructure or not? And that's perhaps an aspect we have underestimated in our industry, you know, is the implication of having to sort of create or implement new infrastructure, new treatment pathways. That's been probably more tedious than we anticipated, but we will need to answer all of these questions at some point.
I'm just wondering.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just wondering on that point. So do you see it so much as, you know, things are going in and out of fashion over time, or is it differences between different investor types, or maybe the geography of where the investor is? Like, where is that kind of coding question coming from? Is it a very highly sophisticated investor that you're dealing with now? Maybe you can say a little bit more about that.
I mean, shall I go? Shall I, Rachel, would you want to take it? Or?
No, go. Yep.
Okay. So I guess one, what we have been lacking in the field of gene therapy is enough success stories of approved medicine, right? So apart from the CAR-Ts who have been turning over, hundreds of millions of dollars, the only real success story, in my view, has been Zolgensma to date, right? Which has been sort of turning over more than $1 billion. I'm encouraged by the emerging, the sales of Elevidys, Sarepta's treatment for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I think it's well on our way to become another $1 billion drug. In the first quarter, they've turned over more than $100 million. That is 6 to 9 months after being approved with a limited label. So we need more success stories, and I think that will, shift the attention back to gene therapy. And I'm confident that in our industry, we will get to more success stories as healthcare systems have now some experience, right, with gene therapies, and companies benefit from improved sort of development pathways, accelerated approval mechanisms, and our manufacturing partners are also more sophisticated with the scale up, and so the CMC development is more rapid. So there's a lot of things I think will work for the industry, and so I look at our industry as as companies which have a success that's highly correlated, positively correlated to one another, right? So I'm rooting for all companies that have approved product, because if they're successful, we will, all companies that are developing medicines will get more attention. At the moment, what I'm experiencing is investors are almost looking for a reason not to invest, whilst 10 years ago, they were looking for a reason to invest, right? So the bar has gone up significantly, and and as said earlier, we just need to address all the questions, as best as we can in the time that we have.
And Andrea, I would add that I think it's a little bit of both, in that there's certainly things that go in and out of the most exciting hot topic category. Right now, I think we can name them quickly. We have obesity, we have ADCs, we have AI, and there's a frenzy, and there's always something that's really exciting. And I think there are good reasons behind all of those, and there generally are good reasons. But there, tends to be a hyper focus on certain areas for a time, and then it might move on because something else has become really compelling. So there are definitely trends and phases that go more quickly than our development programs. There are also differences in investors, but I think I would say, in my experience, not as much geographically as kind of the category of investor. And certainly your retail investors are looking for one thing. You've got folks who are really looking for, certain types of investors are looking for what's your next catalyst and how much volume is there. So I know whether or not there's some liquidity in the stock. So I'm going to give you some cash, and hopefully you're going to deliver on this milestone, and I can decide whether or not I want to get out. And then invest.
That sounds like the institutional vibe, Rochelle.
A lot of the hedge funds, a lot of the folks who were investing in the micro caps in 22 and even in 23. This is, it was really important to them, and they need that liquidity, and then they continue to invest. So they serve a purpose. And I think in our industry, it's pretty interesting how different sets of investors really play different roles in almost a orchestrated manner. It's kind of, fascinating.
Yeah.
And then there are, the institutional investors, some of which are really in there for the long term, and they're looking for very different things. And, a little earlier, we were talking about the talent and the team and how much do you showcase your team. These folks want to know who's, around the table. Definitely. They want to understand how you're working, what your, what the skills and capabilities are, but also what's your culture. And, do you have a hero CEO, or is this somebody who's, working and getting the most out of their team? They want to know all of those things. And on top of the kind of core things that we've been talking about around the science and the commercial opportunity. So I think, we do need to understand the needs of each of those investors. when we're talking with them. And I also noticed over the 22 to 23 timeframe a real difference in even the same investor and their mindset. So given the losses that many of them incurred, you're thinking about some of the investments they couldn't get out of. So they're still kind of, stuck in, but, they want to be there, but they would like to have a path to exit, but they're still supportive. Those created very different needs and honestly different questions by those folks in 2023, even than we saw in 2022. For example, I saw a lot more questions around binary events, that would require the investor to have to write off the whole investment. So we went from being rewarded for, narrowing our pipelines and extending cash runway and being really smart about our focus to, yikes, now all eggs are in one basket. And that also doesn't feel good because I really don't want to have, a write-off of this because of what's been happening. So I do think, we have to be super aware of their specific situation. It's not easy to know that, but there are ways.
So there's a difference between being the darling of the portfolio versus the tall blade of grass. And sometimes you, a little bit of both. Yeah.
No, that's right. That's right.
So we have a question that's come in that I think we can address. It's some of the things we've been thinking about and talking around the periphery of. A gentleman from Tokyo, when PhDs and professors are the entrepreneurs, my personal experience is that the large majority lack business acumen and underestimate that handicap. Can we dive into that a little bit more from whatever angle we sit on? Anyone want to take the first crack?
I can maybe make a couple of comments.
I
think, I do think that we see that there is a need in earlier stage companies to have really strong scientific, acumen. That's important in the leadership role. And then you supplement with kind of what you need for the rest of things, including the business aspect. And I'm thinking about a VP of finance that I know who has been talking to a number of CEOs about future roles. And, and many of them are scientific CEOs. And they do know that they need that. And all of the questions that he's getting are around, can you be my business person? And so I thought that was, a good signal, a good sign. And at least then they have that awareness. But there is a shift in a company as you get later stage where you need more and more kind of business acumen. And sometimes a person will have both. Quite often they do not. And so, it starts to flip into you need a bit more of the business and maybe the science is a little bit more established and can be, almost take that secondary seat. It is a tough thing to make that transition. It's a tough thing inside the boardroom to make that transition and to reallocate resources. It's a very challenging discussion. But we see it time and again where it just, you end up evolving to that point. There are obviously very high profile exceptions. We all know those amazing scientific CEOs that took it all the way and, therefore sometimes decades. That's not everybody.
Nicola?
I think Rachel answered, this perfectly. And as you make the transition from a sort of scientifically driven organization to the commercially driven organization, the relationship between the CEO and the CSO is crucial, right? So I think that is an ingredient of the success or the failure of a biotech company. So the chemistry between the CEO and the CSO is very important, especially in the cases when the CSO, stays within a scientific role. So the harmony between the two is hugely important, right, to the success of the company.
Yeah, from what I've seen, there's, sort of simple answer of this is why incubators exist. And, people should get into incubators where they have really good access to quality experiences from, even around the world. Having seen, I think there's sort of an internal discussion with yourself as a scientific founder and with your board of what do you actually want to do, right? Because if you want to be, quote, a full CEO, that's going to require quite a lot of skill development and, education and communications develop, all these sorts of things. If you just want to be, a CSO or chair of an SAB, that's, that's not wrong. That's great. But and then it's, Rochelle, you made the comment, then it's up to the board to say, how can we bring you along? And, I think you have to have that, call it a courageous conversation. If you happen to just sort of top out, we will have to make a change, and then we're going to put you something else. And how do you do that in a really thoughtful manner? And because you need to respect this person invented the technology, right? You want to do that respectfully. But I think a lot of internal discussions need. Sorry?
They're incredibly valuable. It's just a different job.
Yeah. Neither's wrong. It's just, there's a little bit of that internal choice and capabilities, for lack of a better phrase. Lila, you are back.
I am back, but you've already started the Q&A session, so I'm thrilled about that. I do want to take a moment to thank everyone here, Andrea, Ted, of course, Rochelle, Nicholas. It's been a really great and relevant discussion. We're going to continue with the Q&A. Ted, I think you wanted to address next another that came in.
So my dear former colleague, Paul Jeffrey, a lot of clients, a lot of small biotechs, will keep Paul's clients out of this for a moment, can't spend money on market research. So, okay, you can talk to the KOLs, and going back to this scientific founder concept, that's often fairly straightforward. But how do you get knowledge about whether your value statement has real value for prescribers, patients, payers, et cetera? Who wants to take a crack at that?
So market research doesn't have to be very expensive, right? So I remember when I was at GSK in a business analysis function, right? We used to spend 50 to 60,000 pounds on a qualitative market research, but some agencies would do pretty good work, at a smaller scale, interview with a size of 10 to 20 interviewees for 10, 15,000 pounds. So if you don't have that kind of money, the second best would be to just do some research yourself with external people. But the problem with that is that in the eyes of prospective investors, it's not very credible, right? So it needs to be an external agency, and they will validate the findings of the research themselves with a couple of calls. But research doesn't have to be that expensive. I mean, I'd be happy to liaise with the person just to offer up some ideas and some contacts for some sort of low-cost market research that still provides something useful that you can, present to investors and business partners.
Rochelle?
Maybe I'll add that, for example, at Akari, we did some secondary research for a preclinical program. There was a wealth of data out there. It's not our own. We didn't make it up. You have to make sense of it. It's back to the analogs. You have to kind of marry it up with what it is that you're trying to do and why it's relevant. But we were able to get somebody who used to do this as a job, who had some free time in between roles, which that's always the case in our industry. People are always moving around, and so you can tap somebody who's in between things, and have them work on a discrete project to bring something like that together. I think it's kind of that middle ground. And Nicholas, I'm like you, back in some of the larger companies, we spent an incredible amount of money doing primary research.
It wasn't that useful, was it?
Well, you get it, and you're kind of like, that we already knew 95% of this, so now it's on paper and we can show it to people and say that it's research. But as far as insights inside the company is, it didn't really take you that far. It just gave you that credibility externally. But yeah, so I think there are ways.
Yeah,
I also think that's
Andrea.
I think that's a really good point too, is sort of doing your background work first using secondary sources, so you can be really targeted with the the more pricey market research. Don't ask the basic introductory questions there, but ask the really the questions that are really going to swing point of view one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, I'm coming from industry, I have a somewhat dim view of just saying I went out and did payer market research, because a lot of it is payers telling you how the system works, right? And you can get that for free. It's just a couple hours at your desk to read up a bit. So Rochelle, you know, your comment, the cheapest way to do that is to go to the local business school and find a kid who wants, you know, an internship, and maybe has some history in this area. The other side is, you know, the quote free version just for your time is get online and read reimbursement decisions. They're publicly available. More and more of them are actually even written in English. You know, they'll have a local language and a written language. When I started doing this 20 years ago, you needed a multilingual staff for everything. Now you just need it for, you know, you need it for a variety of things, but you can get some basics down pretty cheap if that therapeutic market exists. And then you might get to those questions that, I really need to talk to somebody, you know, so those ambiguities. So it would be our answer here for my dear friend, Paul. Lila, what's next?
You know, we have a wealth of really good questions that came in. I know that we've talked about investors, but because I work a lot with younger companies, I'm going to bring this one up. How does one effectively identify and meet potential investors?
So,
on this.
you know, I think desk research is a starting point, right? To look at company at you know, investments over the past 12, 24 months in a similar technology or in a similar field. So that's the starting point. But then when you have a board, right, leverage your board and your current investors for introductions to other funds, because there and then you will have a sort of already a selection, and it's always helpful to have an introduction, right? In the current environment, without an introduction, without a contact, it's extremely hard. It's hard enough when you have an introduction. So leverage your contacts and, you know, a bit of desk research. That will be my starting point.
Rochelle?
Yeah, I would just add that if you do have an investor relations team that you're working with somewhere, they can be really useful on this front as well. But it's good, you know, if you meet one, if you can get a reference to somebody else or see who they invest with in other deals, and then you contact those other folks, because quite often you know these investors like to work with and invest together with a similar group of investors. And so, you know, if you're trying to figure out how to bring something together, you may want to talk with all of those folks, knowing that they're likely to make investments together.
Andrea, do you like cold calls as an investor or warm intros?
I think a warm intro is always going to be better. You know, it's certainly going to help if it's someone that I know that has made the referral. I think a few other things, you know, maybe to reiterate points that have been made earlier in the discussion, but just to add, you know, I think it's really important early on to build your network. You never know who's going to be able to help you down the road. And if you're a really early stage company, there's a lot of good programs out there that do support founders in the life sciences. There's a lot of incubators, as you've mentioned, Ted. I think being, you know, thoughtful about the types of programs that you join and participate in early on in your career, and looking at who's involved in those programs, they can be, you know, good sources of introduction, or they can just be, you know, maybe more educational. So knowing the difference between those programs as well, I think, is something to think about and keep in mind.
Well, I'm going to ask a very different question. Ted, I hope you're ready for this one. Has the Inflation Reduction Act drug price controls impacted your valuation methodology yet? And if so, how?
You want me to? I'll start with that. Sort of. I had CEO of a non-US company, so, you know, not the primary expert on something like the IRA, and is investigating breast cancer, and said, I'm getting this question, and it's from investors who are smart enough to be dangerous. They've read about this, but they don't know it, and they're not American, et cetera. And I said, well, you know, it's breast cancer. Well, what's the average age of diagnosis for the patients you're targeting? So 45 to 55, like, not an issue, right? So it's know enough about your disease area to know this. And, you know, I'm a big believer if you're going to do some sort of valuation work, and again, you don't have to do some sort of crazy model, but for the US, it really, really benefits you to break apart how many of your patients would be Medicare, how many would be Medicaid, and how many would be commercially insured. That takes a little bit of knowledge. You're probably going to have to talk to somebody to understand that unless you have somebody on staff. But you really want to break apart your book of business in three. And then it's really, there's some analytics to do. The other side is the threshold, right? If you look at the first 10 Part D products that were chosen, the smallest one is $2 billion per year on Medicare's budget. So are you going to get to that level of revenue? And congratulations if you are, but are you going to get to that level of revenue? Because a lot of people are running around, screaming that the IRA is going to kill them. And you have to think about it. Well, from a financial threshold, it's quite a high threshold, right? I launched Eliquis. It's the top drug in Medicare Part D, $16 billion per annum, right? You're not going to get there, but I'll say the sweet spot right now is about 2 billion. Most of those products are 2 to 3 billion just on Medicare. So you have to do a little bit of analysis to see where you'd be and how would you get to those revenue levels after 11 years and these things. So it is something to think about. I am not in the camp of we're all going to die because the IRA is going to kill all of this. It is crushing small molecules. But I think a little education would actually taper some of I think there's overreaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting thing, just back to valuation models themselves. If you model that out, and how many years is it before any of us in biotech are going to have a problem of a $2 billion revenue stream?
Right.
I think by the time you do the math on that and a little discounting and a little probability of success, you're probably not looking at a big challenge there.
Yeah.
And it's very relevant for businesses that exist, of course, where you've got that large book of business, and overnight you're going to have a very, potentially serious hit to your revenue.
Yeah.
But for many of us, it's really a kind of a theory, and, as you say, nice problem to have.
Lila.
I've got a good one. So if you're looking to attract, as a company, you're looking to attract strategic investors from pharma companies, what are they looking for, and what should you present to get their attention?
Shelley, you want to start?
Yeah, I think probably everybody on this call has something to say about this, but they definitely do the valuation models. That's real, and so understanding kind of your own point of view about the evolution of your business is important, and the economic impact of your drug. You also, I would say, need to understand what problem they're trying to solve. Sometimes it's super easy because they have a stated strategy around building a business of X. But that's not always the case. And so you need to do a little bit of an investigation into their business to understand what holes are they trying to plug? Are they competitive? Are there, there's a challenging situation with some of their revenue streams for whatever reason. Or somebody's come new into the organization and is really excited about a kind of a technology. You just have to do some work to understand why it's good for them, because I think many times we get excited, like, oh, we're going to, tell them all the great things we're doing here at our company and tell them why they really want us, but we don't actually tell them why they really want us. We don't bridge and this is the, discussion we had earlier. We aren't thinking about what they need and why we answer that need. And that's the piece that you can do, I think, to help you be more successful.
Nicola?
So in addition, to complement what Rochelle has been mentioning, which I agree with, the kind of questions we receive from potential strategic pharma partners are very similar to the questions that we get from investors, right? And there's a reason for that, right? Is that investors look for an exit at some point. The difference that I observe is that in speaking with potential strategic partners, you get a more constructive discussion about plugging the holes in your preclinical or clinical development, because pharma companies have tools, methodologies, infrastructure, know-how, etc., that they would like to bring to bear as a partner. So I think it's more, you have, I tend to have a more constructive discussion about, how we can complement the non-clinical package or what it will take in the clinical development. But on the whole, sort of the questions are very similar. And yes, to Rachel's point, they use valuation models, and I've done some of those myself, developed some of those myself with, ROI, EROI, and ENPV, NPV, and what have you.
Andrea?
No, I don't know if I have too much to add. I think it is a matter of understanding what problems they're looking to solve, and sort of being honest with yourself about knowing whether you can help them solve that problem or not. I think it's great if you can get those kind of meetings, but make sure you're meeting with the right person and that you're actually delivering a solution.
Yeah, we one of the most interesting BD calls I had when I was in large companies with a small company was, hey, this is how we think it fits in your sales reps. It was a phase 3 ready, so it would be ready in about 2-3 years for that disease area. Like, we think once your Lipitor reps come off of the patent there, you could transfer. Like, they actually talked about our infrastructure and how it would transition. Pretty dynamic group of people. It does come back to and we would have this because I had a $22 billion portfolio that was going to 10 or 12 billion in about 2 years, because of Lipitor, Celebrex, Viagra, like you name it. And there was always that discussion of how is the young pipeline, which is cheaper to acquire or license, versus I have a revenue gap in 3 to 5 years that is going to be devastating in terms of headcount reductions, et cetera. So you had other people come and say, hey, we think we could help you out. And, they were smart enough about the problems we had and weren't bashful about bringing that up. I think that's another important thing. People don't want to embarrass the potential acquirer. And we said, well, it's too late, right? We can't let these people, these colleagues that we have, sit there for 1.5 years. We either need something sooner, or sadly, we may have to terminate a lot of people. And so understanding those dynamics, whether it's more pipeline or more inline, that can go a long way. And you're probably going to have to talk to a few people to figure that out. And I think with that, Lila, we are out of time.
I wish we could keep going, because this has been a really, really good salon, and we had so many questions come in. But we are out of time for today. But I want to thank everyone on the panel, and of course our viewers. I'd like to thank Biotech Digital Partnering for their support. And just to let you know, we'd love you to join us for future virtual salons. Details of upcoming salons will be posted on the Demy-Colton website and on our social media. And if you'd like to share this with your colleagues or rewatch this, it will be available on demand.
Great. Thanks so much, Lila. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to the team. Thanks, Andrea, Nicholas, and Rochelle.
Thanks,
Hope
everyone.
everybody had a great time. If there are questions, there's a way to submit your email. If you submitted a question, we can try to answer some of those afterwards. So there are ways to do that. So if we didn't get to your question, we still can. And everybody have a great rest of day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Take care.